Rain fell in thick, icy sheets over the city, turning the skyscraper lights into neon blurs. For Davy Jankowski, each drop streaking down the glass of the colossal Walker Innovations building was a note in a chaotic symphony he couldn't silence. The roar of cars, the blare of horns, the distant sirens, it all merged into an overwhelming hum in his mind. He pressed his forehead against the cold window, not to see the city, but to feel something solid, something real to anchor him amidst the sensory turmoil. His thin, pale fingers traced invisible patterns on the damp glass, following a logic only he understood. But that night, his gaze was captured by something within the building. In a ground-floor conference room, a giant screen displayed columns of numbers, charts, and projections. To anyone else, it would be just another dull corporate presentation. To Davy, it was a broken equation, a glaring imbalance, a discordant note that jarred his mental ears. And without realizing it, his fingers stopped tracing random patterns and began to rewrite the formulas on the glass, correcting the error that an army of well-paid analysts couldn't see. How could a homeless young man, invisible to the world, see what a billionaire couldn't? What city or country are you watching me from now? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy stories that show a person's true value isn't in their appearance but in their mind, subscribe to the channel, because what happened next will change how you see the world. Davy Jankowski didn't see the world like most people. Since childhood, the universe for him wasn't made of objects and faces, but of patterns, sequences, and symmetries. The sound of his mother's voice was a perfect, comforting, predictable sine wave. The taste of his favorite food was a harmonious blend of textures and temperatures he could mentally map. But the world outside was loud, unpredictable, and dissonant. The fluorescent lights of school buzzed at an irritating frequency. A casual touch from a classmate felt like an electric shock. Group conversations were a jumbled mess of overlapping sounds, impossible to decipher. His mother, the only one who understood his silent language, told him he had a superpower. "You see the music behind the noise, my son," she'd whisper, helping him sort his building blocks by color, size, and shape in an order that brought peace to his small universe. She gave him his first math book, and it was as if he'd found his native tongue. Numbers didn't lie. Equations were elegant, honest. Logic was a safe haven. But the world didn't see his superpower. It saw a strange boy who wouldn't make eye contact, who rocked his body to self-soothe, and who sometimes collapsed under the weight of an overly loud or bright environment. Teachers called him inattentive, classmates weird. His father, a practical and frustrated man, saw him as a broken project. "Why can't you just be normal, Davy?" he'd ask, his voice a mixture of anger and despair that shattered Davy's internal harmony. After his mother's death, the gentle melody that sustained him vanished. His father didn't have her patience or understanding. The house, once a sanctuary of order, became a place of chaos and demands. At 18, after a particularly painful argument, Davy did the only thing his logic allowed. He left. He took his old math book, the only possession that connected him to his mother, and walked away from the dissonance. Life on the Eid streets was a constant sensory overload. The cold, the hunger, the fear. But paradoxically, it also offered him a kind of freedom. No one expected him to make eye contact. No one forced him into meaningless conversations. He became invisible, and in invisibility, he found a way to survive. He spent his days in public libraries, not reading novels, but devouring books on accounting, physics, and programming. Complex systems were his cathedral. He saw the beauty in how financial balances were supposed to align, in the purity of thermodynamic laws. He wasn't seeking a degree or a job. He was seeking the order the real world denied him. The streets were his exile, but numbers were his homeland. He slept in shelters when he could scrape together a few coins, or in building alcoves wrapped in a thin coat, dreaming of Fibonacci sequences and the golden ratio. The world saw him as a failure, a lost young man. Little did they know that in his mind, he was solving the universe's puzzles, one by one. There were attempts to help, of course. Well-meaning counselors in shelters telling him to try harder in job interviews. "You need a firm handshake, Davy. Look people in the eye. Show confidence." For Davy, it was like asking a fish to climb a tree. He tried. He landed an interview for a stalker position at a supermarket. The blinding lights, the clang of carts, the ambient music, and the manager's rapid-fire questions overwhelmed him. He fell silent, unable to form a response, just rocking gently back and forth. He didn't get the job. He tried a diner, but the mix of smells and the shouted orders left him dizzy and nauseous. He fled midway through the trial period. Each failure was a confirmation of his father's voice in his head. "You're not normal." Society had an instruction manual, and it seemed he was born without a copy. Once, driven by desperate hope, he applied for a filing clerk position at Walker Innovations. It was a dream job, an environment he imagined to be quiet, organized, filled with papers and data. He managed to reach the interview stage. The man interviewing him was impeccably dressed, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His name was William Romano. Romano thumbed through Davy's sparse resume with disdain. "No experience, no references, and frankly, you seem a bit disconnected," he said, his tone laced with barely disguised contempt. Davy tried to explain his affinity for data organization, his ability to spot patterns, but the words came out stumbling, too literal. Romano cut him off with an impatient gesture. "Look, kid, we don't have time for charity projects. We need sharp, communicative people. You're not a fit." The word misfit echoed in Davy's mind as he was ushered out of the imposing building. He sat on the sidewalk across the street, watching people stream in and out, all seeming like pieces of a puzzle he'd never be a part of. The humiliation was a silent wound. He promised himself he'd never try again. It was safer to be invisible. It was less painful to have no hope. The door of Walker Innovations, which for a brief moment had seemed like an opportunity, was now just a reminder of yet another world he didn't belong in. The nights were the hardest. The cold seeped into his bones, and the relative quiet of the sleeping city only amplified the hum in his head. Davy found a place relatively sheltered from the wind in an alcove of the Walker Innovations building. The polished marble was cold, but smooth, and the warmth emanating from a nearby ventilation outlet offered minimal relief. It was in this spot that he became a silent, constant presence, a shadow that the night security team, led by Chief Rafael Castro, learned to ignore, as long as he caused no trouble. And it was there on that night of torrential rain that Davy's life changed. Pressed against the glass, he wasn't just seeking shelter. He was engrossed. The screen in the conference room displayed what he would later understand to be the company's quarterly balance sheet. The numbers danced before his eyes, but the choreography was wrong. There was a hole, a discrepancy of millions hidden behind a series of complex transactions and offshore accounts. To the executives in the room, it was a frustrating problem. To Davy, it was an insult to mathematics. Camille Ivanov, one of the night shift janitors, knew the silent figure outside. She saw him every night, always in the same spot, always quiet. Other staff members eyed him with suspicion. But Camille, who also knew the feeling of being invisible, felt a pang of empathy. That night she noticed something different. The young man wasn't just huddled, he was intensely focused, his fingers moving on the glass as if typing on an invisible keyboard. Curiosity overcame caution. She approached the window from the inside and saw, in the steam left by her breath, the traces of complex equations. She didn't understand what they meant, but she recognized the intelligence and obsession in every line. On impulse, she unlocked a side service door. "Hey," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. "It's too cold out there. Come in. I'll make you some tea. Nobody will know." Davy hesitated, the unexpected invitation breaking his routine. But Camille's gentle gaze and the promise of warmth convinced him. He stepped inside, soaked and trembling, clutching his math book as if it were a shield. Camille led him to the small staff break room, away from the main offices. She gave him a mug of hot tea, and he held it with both hands, absorbing the warmth. He didn't speak much, just a whispered thank you. As he drank his tea, his eyes kept drifting toward the conference room, now empty, but with the screen still on, displaying the problematic numbers. "What were you looking at?" Camille asked, genuinely curious. Davy gestured with his chin. "It's wrong," he said with disarming simplicity. "The balance sheet, the sum doesn't add up. There's an outflow of funds masked as R&D investment, but the trail is circular. The money is being siphoned off." Camille blinked, not understanding half the words but grasping the gravity in his tone. She saw the flicker in his eyes. the need to fix that disorder. Can you prove it?" she asked. Davi nodded vigorously. All he needed was paper and a pen. Camille looked around. Taking office supplies was against the rules, but something in the young man's conviction made her break another rule that night. She grabbed a yellow legal pad and a pen from a secretary's desk. "Here," she said. "Show me." What followed was one of the most extraordinary sights Camille had ever witnessed. Davi sat on the break room floor, the notepad on his lap, and began to write. The pen flew across the page. He didn't pause to think. It was as if the solution was already complete in his mind, and he was merely transcribing it. Numbers, arrows, charts, notes in the margins. He filled page after page with precise, dense handwriting. He wasn't just finding the error. He was mapping the entire fraud, tracing the money through multiple layers of deception, revealing the architecture of the cheat. He worked for hours, oblivious to time, to the world, to anything but the pure logic of numbers. Camille watched him in silence, making more tea, feeling like the keeper of a secret, profound moment. As dawn broke and her shift was ending, Davi stopped. He handed her the notepad. It was almost entirely filled. He looked exhausted, but his eyes shone with the satisfaction of having restored order. "It's all there," he said. "The balance." Before Camille could say anything, he stood up, thanked her again for the tea, and slipped out the service door, disappearing into the gray morning light, like the shadow he had always been. Camille stood with the notepad in her hands, an object that felt heavy with the significance of its contents. What should she do? Ignore it? Hand it over to security and risk her job for letting a stranger in? Or believe? She flipped through the pages. It was a language she didn't speak, but the structure, the organization, the clarity of thought were evident. She thought of the panic she heard in the hushed whispers of executives in the hallways, the crisis looming over the company, and she thought of the brilliant, invisible young man who had fixed it all on the floor of a break room. She made a decision. She knew the CEO, Henry Walker, was known for being a fair man who arrived early, before everyone else. Instead of leaving the notepad on a random desk, she went to the top floor. Her heart pounding, she entered Walker's opulent office and placed the yellow notepad squarely in the center of his mahogany desk, where he couldn't miss it. It was the biggest risk of her life, an act of faith in a genius the world had discarded. Henry Walker arrived at his office at 6 in the morning, as usual. He was a man who had built his empire from scratch, a billionaire who still understood the value of hard work. But for the past few weeks, he hadn't been sleeping well. A shortfall of nearly $100 million had appeared in his accounts, a ghost in the ledger that his finance team, led by the brilliant and charismatic CFO William Romano, couldn't explain. They spoke of system glitches, complex anomalies, but Walker's gut told him there was more, and then he saw it. The yellow notepad on his desk. It wasn't from his secretary. He picked it up, intrigued. The first few pages were a sea of calculations that made him frown. But as he progressed, his expression shifted from confusion to shock, and from shock to stunned admiration. He, who had started his career as an accountant, immediately recognized the elegance and genius on those pages. It wasn't just the solution to the problem. It was a forensic dissection of a financial crime. The analysis was deeper, faster, and more accurate than anything his team of elite specialists had produced in weeks. "Zoe," he said into his intercom, calling his executive assistant Zoe Ramirez, "cancel all my meetings for this morning and have Rafael Castro from security come to my office. Now." When Rafael arrived, Walker showed him the notepad. "I want to know who left this on my desk. Check the security cameras on all floors, especially mine. I don't care what it takes, find this person." The investigation didn't take long. The cameras clearly showed Camille Ivanov entering the office. When confronted by Rafael and Walker, she was terrified, certain she'd be fired. In a trembling voice, she told the whole story. The young man in the rain, the equations on the glass, the feverish work in the break room. Walker listened in silence, his face unreadable. "Where is this young man now?" he asked. Camille shrugged, desolate. "I don't know. He just left." Walker looked at Rafael. "Find him. Use her description. Check the street cameras. I want to talk to him." It took nearly 24 hours. but Raphael's team finally located Davi at his usual spot outside the building. The approach was delicate. Raphael, a large but soft-spoken man, approached alone. "Davi Jankowski?" he asked. Davi flinched, expecting trouble. "Mr. Walker would like to speak with you." "About this," Raphael said, showing him the yellow notepad. Davi's eyes fixed on the object, the order he had created. He nodded silently and followed Raphael into the building, this time through the front door. The meeting in Henry Walker's office was surreal. Davi was uncomfortable in his worn clothes, avoiding the billionaire's gaze, focusing instead on a pattern on the Persian rug. Walker, sensing his distress, didn't push. He simply opened the notepad. "Can you explain this to me?" he asked, pointing to a particularly complex formula. And then the magic happened. Speaking the language of numbers, Davi transformed. He stood up, walked to a whiteboard in the office, and with a marker, began to explain. He didn't talk about people or intentions, only data. He showed how funds were siphoned through shell companies, how reports were altered to hide the tracks, and how it all connected to a single source within the company. Henry Walker watched, fascinated. He wasn't seeing a homeless man. He was seeing one of the brightest minds he had ever encountered. And at the center of the meticulously planned fraud by his CFO, William Romano, was the irrefutable proof of his betrayal. Davi's small victory wasn't getting a billionaire's attention. It was the moment someone finally understood the music he heard. Henry Walker felt a surge of conflicting emotions: fury at Romano's betrayal, gratitude for Davi's discovery, and a profound sense of shame. Shame for himself and the system he represented. How many Davies were out there, invisible, discarded because they didn't fit the corporate mold? He, who prided himself on his meritocracy, realized his definition of merit was dangerously narrow. He looked at Davy, who was now quiet again, his energy spent from the burst of brilliance. "You need a place to stay," Walker said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. He arranged for Davy to be settled into a corporate apartment, a silent, minimalist space with everything he needed: new clothes, food, and most importantly, books. Dozens of books on advanced mathematics, cryptography, and data analysis. For the first time in years, Davy had a ceiling over his head that wasn't the city's polluted sky. He had a door he could lock, silencing the chaos of the outside world. Walker spent the next few days talking with Davy. He learned to ask direct questions, to give him space, and not to expect social niceties that Davy couldn't offer. In return, Davy gave him an insight into his company that no report could provide. He saw Walker Innovation's structure as a living system, with flows of energy, inefficiencies, and choke points. He offered no opinions, only diagnoses based on pure data. Walker realized he hadn't just found a savior for his company. He had found a new paradigm. He created a role for Davy, strategic systems analyst. It wasn't a position with meetings or forced social interaction. It was a quiet room, with the best technology, where Davy could do what he did best: find the truth in numbers. Davy's transformation was subtle yet profound. He still preferred silence, still soothed himself by organizing objects, but the haunted look in his eyes began to fade. The security of having a place, a purpose, and above all, acceptance, was the foundation upon which he could finally build a life. And Henry Walker's transformation was equally significant. He instituted new recruitment programs focused on neurodivergent talent, actively seeking out minds that thought differently. He understood that true innovation came not from conformity, but from the unique perspectives that diversity brought. Davy didn't just save him from a fraud, he saved him from his own blindness. The climax was carefully orchestrated by Henry Walker. He called an emergency meeting with the entire board of directors and senior executives. William Romano entered the conference room, the epitome of confidence, greeting everyone with his polished smile. He believed the meeting was to discuss the accounting anomalies, and was prepared with a jargon-filled presentation designed to confuse and reassure everyone. Walker began the meeting on a somber note. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, we have been facing a significant financial challenge, a problem our finance team has been unable to resolve." Romano seized the floor, ready for his show. "Henry, as I've explained, it's a complex failure in the data integration system." Walker interrupted him. "No, William. It's not a system failure, it's fraud. A murmur swept through the room. Romano paled slightly but maintained his composure. "That's a very serious accusation, Henry. Do you have any proof?" "I have more than proof," Walker said. "I have the source of truth." He signaled, and the conference room door opened. Davy Jankowski walked in. He wore a simple, yet well-fitting suit. His hair was neatly cut. He no longer looked homeless, but he still carried an aura of quiet intensity. Romano glanced at Davy, and a flash of recognition followed by pure disdain crossed his face. He laughed, a dry, arrogant sound. "This is it? This is your proof? The freak I turned down for an archivist position? You're basing a fraud accusation on a vagrant?" The room erupted in whispers. Board members, like Chloe Ito and Michael Jones Flores, looked from Walker to Romano, confused. Walker remained calm. "Davy, please." Davy walked to the massive interactive whiteboard. He didn't say a word to the audience. He picked up the digital pen and, in absolute silence, began to map out the fraud. Lines connected accounts. Numbers appeared and were circled. Dates, transactions, names of shell companies. In under 10 minutes, he recreated, from memory, the entire analysis from the yellow notepad, but visually, undeniably. The room watched, mesmerized. Romano's arrogance melted away, replaced by a growing panic. The whiteboard was a mirror of his crimes, exposed with brutal clarity. When Davy finished, he stepped back from the board. The evidence was there for all to see, irrefutable. Henry Walker stood up. "William Romano, you have embezzled $96 million from this company. You betrayed our trust and nearly brought us to ruin." Romano cornered, tried. One last attack. He pointed a trembling finger at Davy. "You're going to believe him? Look at him. He's abnormal, a lunatic." As security, led by Rafael Castro, moved to escort him out, Romano brushed past Davy and spat. "What are you looking at, freak?" Davy, who had until then avoided everyone's gaze, turned slowly and looked directly into Romano's eyes for the first time. His voice was low, but it cut through the room's silence. "The imbalance." The statement, short and precise, was devastating. It wasn't an insult, it was a diagnosis, the final declaration of order over chaos. Romano was left speechless, his face a mask of fury and defeat. As he was led away, the final image in everyone's mind was of Davy Jankowski, the young man the world had thrown away, standing calm and sure before the truth he alone had revealed, with Henry Walker placing a firm, respectful hand on his shoulder. This story reminds us that a person's value cannot be measured by their ability to conform, but by their courage to be authentic. Davy didn't change who he was to fit the world. The world around him had to change to recognize his genius. True hope lies not in erasing our differences, but in building a world where those differences are seen as the strength they truly are. If this story touched you, if it made you think about the hidden talents that might be all around us, just waiting for a chance to be seen, then please like this video, comment with your own experience, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes a small story can change how we see the world, and maybe someone you know needs to hear this today.